I shall now proceed to tell you about Adorno and Horkheimer's culture industry, Enlightenment as Mass Deception, followed by Susan Sontag's Against Interpretation. Culture industry, Enlightenment as Mass Deception, is a chapter from the book Dialectic Enlightenment, published in 1944. Adorno and Horkheimer were largely influenced by the socio-political environment of the time and the writings of several other theorists popular at the time. It was written during World War II, which was a demonstration of the power of a dictatorship and propaganda, and simultaneously the American film industry, which demonstrated an extreme monopolism. Adorno and Horkheimer were influenced largely by Karl Marx's theories of alienation and commodity fetishism, and also expanded on Kant's theory. The two authors wrote, "The man with leisure has to accept what the culture manufacturers offer him." Kant's formalism still expected a contribution from the individual, who was thought to relate the varied experiences of the senses to fundamental concepts, but the industry robs the individual of his function. Culture industry, Enlightenment as Mass Deception, discusses Adorno and Horkheimer's famous notion of the culture industry and the view that the capitalist society's culture industry, an aspect of Enlightenment, has betrayed itself by allowing instrumental logic to take over human social life. According to Adorno and Horkheimer, the culture industry is a main phenomenon of late capitalism. Encompassing all products and form of light entertainment, from films to elevator music, these forms are designed to satisfy the growing needs of mass capitalistic consumers for entertainment. The products of the culture economy can take on the appearance of art, but they're actually dependent on the industry and economy, therefore subjected to the interests of money and power. All products are made for one thing: profit. From this point, they suggest that every artwork is turned into a consumer product and is shaped by the logic of capitalist rationality, i.e., whatever sells best. Which leads to artwork no longer being autonomous, but is becoming a commodified product of the economic relations of production. The main argument within the text is that the commodification of culture leads to the commodification of human consciousness, leading to the eradication of independent thinking by providing easy entertainment which distracts us from the injustices of the ruling order. They argue that the culture industry has taken over reality, and we have begun living in this prism through which we experience reality, which consequently shapes and conditions our own experience of life. Not only has the culture industry provided us with a fabricated reality, it also offers to keep workers busy, through offering a refuge and distraction from work. However, just leads us further into the world of products and consumerism. This can be simplified by saying the only thing the culture industry does give us is freedom from thinking. By people consuming the mass products which are advertised and manipulated by the industry, which people think will satisfy their needs and wants, they turn into submissive and subordinated subjects, unable to take full responsibility for their actions. Adorno and Horkheimer highlight this as concerning, as full responsibility is crucial for a functioning democracy. The culture industry is using production line mentality in producing cultural products, an example being that all films and TV shows we watch are different. However, they follow the same recycled formulas, similar to that of other products. The consumers have the feeling that there is something for everyone, where in fact they are just all variations of the same thing. Nothing is unique nor original. This works to the culture industry's advantage, as all products are produced under the same schema, therefore are effortlessly readable and easily digested. This reiterates the ideas of conformity and how the culture industry imposes it. The final point made in this text is that people under capitalism suffer the same fate of art under the culture industry. They are reduced to the exchange value with no intrinsic or unique traits. Ideas surrounding Adorno and Horkheimer's texts can also be related to the Lego movie, which was released in 2014 and depicts the ideas surrounding mass culture through the storyline of the dictator homogenizing culture to the point that there's only one television show, a single song, etc., to the point that conformity is the norm and the citizens live in a fabricated reality. This next clip, which I'm about to show you, is footage from the Lego Movie, exemplifying Adorno and Horkheimer's text.
Step 13, enjoy popular music.
Jump the charts again, it's Everything is Awesome.
Oh my gosh, I love this song!
Everything is awesome. Everything is cool when we're part of a team. Everything is awesome when we're living our dream.
Always use a turn signal, park between the lines. Yes! Drop off dry cleaning before noon, read the headlines, don't forget to smile, always root for the local sports team.
Go sports team!
Always return a compliment. Hey, you look nice.
So do you.
Drink overpriced coffee.
There you go. That's $37.
Awesome!
To discuss the culture industry in relation to art, I must reiterate that the products in and of the culture economy take the appearance of artwork, but are in fact dependent on industry and economy. A particular artistic movement based around that very ideal would be pop art. This image of Richard Hamilton's "Just what is it that makes today's homes so different, so appealing?" demonstrates pop art's integration of the sociological context of its time with consumerism and a booming economy. Adorno and Horkheimer believed that every work of art is turned into a consumer product and is a shaped rationale of capitalism, which is to make money. Common objects that people use in their daily lives and are important because of their usefulness are instead elevated on an aesthetic level, transforming their circumstantial form and turning them into pieces of art. Regardless, those common objects are products of mass consumption belonging to the culture industry. Speaking about personal leisure time and elements of entertainment in our lives, Adorno writes, "No independent thinking must be expected from the audience. The product prescribes every reaction, not by its natural structure, which collapses under reflection, but by signals." When we look at Hamilton's work, these words also make sense because the art pieces we see, which are just recontextualized commodities and familiar objects, display nothing other than the object itself. The product prescribes its reaction. Andy Warhol's 32 Cans demonstrates that our reaction to that piece is not determined by what it looked like, but rather the repetition of its image. The confrontation with the mass of repeated imagery is the signal which provides a familiarity. These artworks are mere products of the culture economy, having taken on the appearance of artwork, but in fact are dependent on industry and economy, which, I reiterate again, mean they are subjected to the interests of money and power. Adorno and Horkheimer claim that culture industry positions the masses as objects of manipulation, instead of just satisfying their wants and needs. This turns people into passive and subordinated subjects, unable to take full critical responsibility for their own actions, something crucial for a functioning democracy. People therefore gladly give in and help maintain the system by playing to its assertions. American conceptual artist, designer and writer Barbara Kruger highlights how society, with media culture and social memes, mould our desires, attitudes and opinions, offering a thought-provoking reflection of ourselves and the ideals of the culture industry. Her work outlines how we shop not only for goods, but as a means to identify ourselves with the crowd and be just like everyone else. She is synonymizing our experience with the act of shopping. By doing so, she challenges the conventions in which the audience's attitudes and views are dictated by the societal status quo. This demonstrates how we play to the system of the culture industry and shows us the frivolity in which mankind has become gluttonous and superficial. Adorno's text stresses the fact that the culture industry uses a production line mentality in producing cultural products. Seemingly all products are different, but in fact they follow the same recycled formula types of consumer goods. There is a supposed feel that there is something for everyone, and each material possession will change our lives for the better in some way, when in fact it's all variations of the same thing. Adorno and Horkheimer write, "Amusement has become an extension of labour under late capitalism." This quote comments how they report that popular culture appears to be offering a refuge and a distraction from work, but in fact causes the worker to further dwell into a world of products and consumerism. The only freedom culture industry really has to offer is a freedom from thinking. Buy Me, I'll Change Your Life is another work of Kruger's which attempts to address how we're kept distracted by the connotations and desires of products, as if they are an escapism rather than a component of the working environment and industry. She accomplishes this in a way which exposes their extension of labour through a satirical slogan alone. Adorno and Horkheimer essentially propose that the culture industry, including film, TV, radio and magazines of the time, once regarded as forms of art, were being produced in the same machine-like manufacturing process, symptomatic of the capitalist society. They perceived that the world was becoming homogenized under the capitalist ideology of mass production, and by spoon-feeding propaganda to the masses to manipulate them into a passive state of mind. Consumption of these cultured art forms was made easier and more convenient. It was thought that this would create a happier, more docile society and assist in the higher authorities' bid to gain control. They regarded the mass production of art to be as much about profit and power as any other industry. To an extent, this was true. Freud's nephew, the Austrian-American pioneer of propaganda Edward Bernays, was the first person to take his uncle's theories about the unconscious desires of human beings to shift America from a needs to a desires culture. However, Adorno and Horkheimer wrote The Culture Industry, Enlightenment as Mass Deception from a highly subjective perspective. They had moved from Germany to America in the 1930s and written the text during World War II. They saw the impact of mass media in America and compared this to the way Hitler had gained control through propaganda across Germany in the rise of fascism. Witnessing America's full-scale effort to exploit mass media and as a means of rallying patriotism and involvement in the war was a phenomenon the authors had experienced before. Hence the exaggerated pessimism within the essay is in part a result of modelling the power of media on Nazi Germany's use of propaganda and culture to mobilise the masses. Although the two paradigms were not specifically mentioned, the essay was undeniably constructed based on their experience of a totalitarian state and the free market of a democratic United States. From this, however, we are led to question if the theories the authors produce are relevant beyond these contexts. On the subject of context, many later social theorists have agreed that Adorno's perception of the culture industry is historically limited. As the literary critic and Marxist political theorist Frederick Jameson observed, the idea of the culture industry can be defended as a useful theory for industrial societies between 1920 and 1970, but trying to use it today weakens its effectiveness, particularly as the developments of society and media today have far exceeded the cultural possibilities available in the 1940s. For example, although the 1940s culture industry, particularly in radio and television, did allow for an audience's immediate response or interaction, this one-sidedness of media and communication has changed with the introduction of digital technology. We can now answer back. Adorno's macro view on culture is heavily outdated in a world where social media, cable TV and the internet allow for microcultures and conversation across the media. Nevertheless, some of the theories Adorno and Horkheimer present are still relevant to today's culture industry and consumerist ideologies. We still often place a high value on a product for its symbolic status and what it might reflect on our reputation, rather than valuing something purely for its practical and functional value. Not only this, but media and the products of the culture industry such as films and popular music are still regarded as commodities in a sense, and the mass media is still very much an enterprise instead of an expressive art form. One of the more significant differences now, however, is that the consumer's role is no longer as passive as it was in the 1940s. It is important to note that both authors, particularly Adorno, were highly regarded as Marxist thinkers. As both were opposed to the growth and presence of the culture industry, it is interesting that no strong Marxist resolution or analysis is apparent within the text. The authors comment on the situation with Marxist ideology, forming the underlying basis of the essay. However, despite their association with Marxism, both went to the Marxist Frankfurt Institute for Social Research. Both failed to suggest that even a Marxist ideology would be more successful. A final point to note in the essay, as the German philosopher and journalist Rolf Wiggerhaus picked up on, is that the younger generation of critical theorists generally ignore Adorno's work, partly because Adorno is unable to provide practical examples and conclusions from his theories. Adorno and Horkheimer use general examples to back up and illustrate their arguments, such as how Beethoven has now become commodified and Donald Duck serves as a life lesson to take punishment and laugh at the misfortune of others. However, there is no external reference to the theories of other authors or solid evidence to back up their argument. The main focus is on the macro context rather than understanding it in a micro sense. Adorno's research too seems to dismiss a micro understanding, as he fails to discuss the production process that happens within the culture industry for films, radio, TV, etc., and does not discuss how the industrial sectors are all economically reliant on each other, such as how the business sector, particularly marketing and advertising, might be reliant on culture and mass communication. From this, critics are led to question Adorno's understanding of the situation and the industry from an objective point of view. Susan Sontag's Against Interpretation looks into the issue of interpretation in art. She discusses the two aspects of interpretation: formalist interpretation and also content-based interpretation. One of her ideas is to remove the idea that art possesses content. She strongly believes that the interpretation of content produces multiple meanings and would interfere with the true meaning of the artwork even when it's clearly shown. Another point, she states, is the increasing negligence of the formal aspects of artworks. She believes interpretation obscures the very basics of a piece, and assumptions should be made through observations and not about what one thinks it means. In short, she believes the very issue of interpretation is that the mass production of work and the multiple readings in art causes one's sense of appreciation of a piece to be clouded so much that even the form of the art is overlooked, reducing the piece only to its content. Arguments that Sontag will maintain throughout the essay are: to interpret an artwork is to not take it seriously. The project of interpretation is never, or can never be, completed. Sontag wants to do away with the notion that artworks possess content, a mistake she claims is perpetuated by interpretation. She says that interpretation consists of two actions, which are not considering the artwork as a whole and translating the artwork or explaining what the artwork means. Sontag is syncing up interpretation with allegory. To interpret art, she argues, is to first assume that all art is allegorical or symbolic. The appearance of a piece is also important and should be taken seriously. Artwork is exactly what it appears to be. She praises artists who devise artworks that discourage metaphorical interpretation, those who make abstract paintings and pop art. Sontag looks for formalism, something more predicated on the observation of an artwork's appearance as opposed to discussing its content. Throughout the essay, she calls for critics to describe the artwork as a whole, using a vocabulary of forms that add nothing extraneous to the artwork. The essay is famously concluded with, quote, "In place of a hermeneutics, we need an erotics of art." By hermeneutics, Sontag clearly means the tendency to metaphorically interpret art, the critical practice she's been railing against throughout the essay, putting strong emphasis that instead of complicated readings, we should focus on our experience of the art. Susan Sontag, 1933 to 2004, was a second-generation New York Jew. She was a bookish child and grew up to study philosophy at the University of Chicago, Harvard, Oxford, and the Sorbonne. She became a writer, filmmaker, teacher, political activist, and critic, writing extensively about photography, culture, and media, AIDS and illness, human rights, communism, and leftist ideology. Sontag began writing at a time in American history when high and low class were converging. She tried to understand how it was possible to experience and appreciate high and low culture and maintain a hierarchical sense of values. The political and intellectual climate of the 1960s and 1970s allowed her to cultivate her ideas and demonstrated her talent for addressing the social changes of the time. This time period reflected a change in American culture and thought. The radicalization of the college students and protest of the Vietnam War allowed for a more liberal media. She published her first major work, the essay Notes on Camp, in 1964, to be followed by Against Interpretation and Other Essays 2 years later. Both essays were met with wide acclaim, shaking up the literary establishment and propelling Sontag into instant intellectual celebrity. Other works include On Photography, Styles of Radical Will, The Way We Live Now, Illness as a Metaphor, Regarding the Pain of Others, The Volcano Lover, and In America. Her essays were efforts to expand what could be taken seriously in the arts. By being serious about subjects and art forms that had not been given their intellectual due, Sontag's writings were a shock to the American system. When considering postmodern art, Sontag writes about camp. This, she says, is a certain mode of aestheticism. It is one way of seeing the world as an aesthetic phenomenon. That way, the way of camp, is not in terms of beauty, but in terms of the degree of artifice. A person who enjoyed camp art would be ridiculed by their peers for their poor taste. However, with this essay came the appreciation of postmodern art as a legitimate form. Sontag bases much of her argument on personal taste. Notes on Camp also had a profound effect on the careers of many artists and filmmakers, most notably Andy Warhol. His campy style of art became socially acceptable and gained mass appeal after the publication of this essay. Today, Warhol's art continues to be one of the defining examples of camp. Other theorists at the time include Roland Barthes, Jacques Derrida, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Marshall McLuhan, Jean Baudrillard, and Jean-François Lyotard. Among these, there were writers and philosophers who often had very strong opinions about Sontag's writing. She herself declined to join any theoretical school and as a result invited criticism. For instance, she thought Baudrillard was a political and social idiot, labelling him as ignorant and cynical. In Regarding the Pain of Others, Sontag tries to dislodge Guy Debord and Jean Baudrillard from the pantheon of postmodern media studies, it is said, with little effect. Historian Hofstadter hugely resented her comments about the white race being the cancer of human history. Academic and social critic Camille Paglia initially admired Sontag, but then became disillusioned with her views on feminism, and historian Ellen Lee accused her of plagiarism. One theorist Sontag admired was Roland Barthes, of whom she said, "At least Roland Barthes has the courage of his sexual tastes. He liked countries in North Africa and Asia where he could sleep with boys." This was relating to her frustration with writers commenting on situations around the world when they had spent very little time experiencing them or their people. Sontag herself spent extended periods of time in Vietnam, Israel, and Sarajevo. Although her critics would mock her, they also acknowledged her bravery. Sontag said to Evans Chan in 2001, "There are intellectuals and intellectuals. The majority of them are conformists, but some are brave, very brave. And what are intellectuals doing with postmodernism? How people move these terms around instead of looking at the concrete reality. I'm for complexity and the respect for reality. I don't want to think anything theoretically in that sense. My interest is to understand the genealogy of ideas. If I'm against interpretation, I'm not against interpretation as such, because all thinking is interpretation. I'm actually against reductive interpretation, and I'm against facile transposition and the making of cheap equivalences." Sontag's views in the text can be drawn into contemporary works of art. In British artist Cecily Brown's work, which happens to be figurative and abstract, Sontag dismisses this style of painting completely by stating that abstract painting is the attempt to have, in the ordinary sense, no content. Since there is no content, there can be no interpretation. However, ironically, this is her interpretation and a very biased statement about the validity of abstract paintings. Abstract art is a form of expressionism, and consequently you express yourself through the concepts and mark making. Even if the image is disjointed or hazy, the brush strokes themselves can be interpreted as well as the spectrum of colours used. To say that there is no content in abstract painting is very biased and unjustified. Within Brown's work, an example being the painting High Society, she critiques society, class and order, and we as the viewer become mesmerised in the fleshy, disorderly limbs and orifices. We are induced to follow the narrative around the canvas. This is our interpretation. Francis Bacon's piece of Pope Innocent X is another example of a piece of art against Sontag's argument. There is a large amount that can be interpreted from Pope Innocent X and its content. The piece itself is terrifying as we view a depiction of a religious icon screaming. This, teamed with the violent, fast paint marks, abstract the figure, and ironically, this piece is a reinterpretation from the painting of Pope Innocent X by Spanish artist Diego Velázquez in 1650. Sontag states that there is an infestation of art by interpretations. However, this over-exaggeration of a plague in the infestation of art that Sontag talks about is the complete opposite and just inspires new and appropriated work such as that of Jeff Koons, who appropriates the majority of his work, such as in String of Puppies, which he appropriated from a photograph by Art Rogers. Even though it could be classed as his interpretation, it was more of a copy than simply interpretation, such as Bacon's Pope Innocent X. Therefore, in this particular piece of work by Koons, Sontag's argument of the infestation of art by interpretations seems just. You could almost see it as a form of graffiti on Rogers' work. Furthermore, interpretation within art is key to how you perceive it, rather than the artist creating a literal piece as well as the whole experience of looking at art. We have to make our own interpretation on Irish artist Michael Craig Martin's work, such as in his most prominent and controversial piece, An Oak Tree. Without the interpretation and content behind it, it is just a glass of water sitting in a gallery space, a literal understanding. However, he connotes that people need and have to interpret his work because of its highly controversial concept, and he states that people need to find meanings. Meaning is both persistent and unstable. Within the text, there are some concepts and views to be disagreed with Sontag about. Sontag argues that the concern of the critic is not to discover the meaning of work, but to talk around it. She never gets around to solidly defining meaning, but you assume she notions by reducing the work of art and its content and then interpreting that, one tames the work of art. Interpretation makes art manageable, comfortable. Sontag says, it doesn't matter whether artists intend or do not intend for their works to be interpreted. She's being contradictory because what she's implying is dismissing the original intention of the author by saying that whether or not the piece has an intention or not doesn't matter. However, she then shows that she supports abstract art and pop art that discourages symbolic interpretation. If it doesn't matter, then why would she be so supportive of abstract and pop art? Because if the authorial intention truly doesn't matter, then it shouldn't matter whether or not the artist put obvious symbols into his or her work, whether or not he or she makes abstract work that discourages symbolic interpretation. As an example of a possibly intended allegory, Sontag described the scene in Ingmar Bergman's The Silence, 1963, in which an image of a tank rumbling down an empty night street, where she acknowledges that the director may have been intending the image as a phallic symbol. But if he did so, Sontag continues, it was a foolish thought, because Sontag wants no symbols. The whole concept is very subjective to Sontag's view. She mentions that the content and any symbolic and allegorical meaning should be ignored, and just look at the formal aspects of the piece of artwork. But we question, why should it be ignored? Though of course not all critics make out the same meaning as the artist or author intended. Additionally, there is a disagreement with Sontag's characterization of the novel, where she states, the cinema, unlike the novel, possesses a vocabulary of forms. Novels are no different than films. They're just as formal as them. That said, novels may seem more transparent and contentful to audiences, but there is nothing to stop them possessing a vocabulary of forms as well. If any film demands to be seen in the way that Sontag suggests, it is Persona by Ingmar Bergman. What more do you need when the film is beautifully constructed with captivating monologues, frames and camera movement? The film's aural and visual components give rise to the kind of sensory, erotic viewing experience that Sontag calls for. The problem lies with the viewers, ultimately where they spend too much time trying to intellectually comprehend films that they overlook the aesthetic potential of the image and its ability to stimulate emotional and sensory actions.